There we go, right with the introduction. The basics, Brian already mentioned that mangaves are a hybrid between manfredas and agaves. They're closely related, and that's why you can hybridize them. There are some mangaves that occur naturally, not a lot. Most of the ones that, practically all of the ones that you can buy in nurseries are man-made. This is the bit of taxonomy that Brian also mentioned. Joachim Tied's treatment of manfredas and polyanthes and prochnianthes, he merged them all into agaves, which, as you see, necessitated some name changes. And if this were universally accepted, Mangave as a hybrid genus would disappear because they would all simply just be agave hybrids. It's not universally embraced, not in the horticulture industry. And so for our purposes, they're separate genera, and Mangave is a hybrid genus between the two of them. Now, what's in the name? Brian also mentioned this. As per the International Code of Nomenclature, for algae, fungi, and plants, the name of an intergeneric hybrid consists of the first part or the whole of genus 1 and the last part of the whole of genus 2. So here we have the man from Manfreda and the agave from agave. It becomes mangave, and that's why it's pronounced mangave, not mangave. I have heard people say that. It kind of hurts, but you know, makes sense when you don't know that. The X in the name, XMangave, indicates that it's a hybrid genus. It's a multiplication sign, not the letter X. It's not pronounced, and it's typically omitted when you talk or write about them informally. Now, until very recently, I thought that the first mangave that was known about was Machamocha. And I'll talk about Machamocha in a second. But Brian recently learned about a much earlier mangave. It was originally described in 1889 as Agave X roveliana, based on a plant growing at the Botanical Garden of Palermo in Sicily. And then again in 1893 as Agave terraccianoi, based on a plant growing at the Botanical Garden in Berlin. The description here compares this Agave terraccianoi to Manfreda maculata, which at the time went by the name Agave maculata. But it states that it differs from it by having perennial leaves rather than deciduous. And that kind of indicates that it is a hybrid. The source of the plant was not known to Dr. Pax, who described it in 1893, but he thought the place of origin was Mexico or Texas, which pretty much covers all the bases. What is really interesting is that offsets of the originally described Agave X roveliana are still alive at the Berlin Botanic Garden today. The photos on the right are from Michael Greulich's book, Die Welt der Agaven, The World of the Agaves, published in 2017 by the German Cactus Society. And looking at the leaves and the flowers, well, for sure the leaves, it's immediately clear that this is a mangave, not an agave. And the description says, presumably a hybrid of a Manfreda with an unknown agave species. The leaves are narrow, green, and delicately toothed, with reddish brown dots in the summer. In contrast to the typical Manfreda species, it does not lose its leaves during the dormant season. It splits after flowering, which occurs almost annually in older plants, and eventually forms larger groups. The dark red flowers are very ornamental and will delight any collector. I mean, taste is personal, but to me, it's a rather unremarkable hybrid, but it's noteworthy for, you know, its historical significance. Which brings us to these guys, Carl Schoenfeld, Tony Avent, and Hans Hansen. They are credited with finding, naming, propagating, and popularizing what was thought to be the first mangave Machamocha, about 20 years ago. It all started in 2003. Carl Schoenfeld, at the time the owner of Yakadu Nursery in Texas, had just come back from a botanizing trip to northern Mexico where he had collected seeds of what he thought was Manfreda variegata. After the seeds had germinated, he noticed that two seedlings in the batch were significantly larger than the others, which kind of surprised him. He checked with some colleagues in the industry, including Tony Avent of Plant Delights Nursery in North Carolina, and they came to the conclusion that these seedlings most likely were a hybrid. Manfreda variegata crossed with agave mitis, which was flowering nearby where Carl had collected the seeds. Carl and Tony gave this new hybrid the name Mangave, and the Manfreda variegata agave mitis cross became Mangave machamocha, the first plant to be officially called a mangave. These are some pictures of Brian's that from the Ruth Bancroft garden, I assume. But this was just the beginning. The machamocha from Yakadu was sent to another plant guy, Hans Hansen, who at the time ran the tissue culture lab at Shady Oaks, a specialty hosta nursery in Minnesota. Hans successfully tissue cultured machamocha, and it was introduced commercially in 2004 by both Yakadu and Plant Delights. But that was just the beginning. It's Celsiae. Midas is the same as Celsiae, yeah. I think Midas is the currently accepted name. At around the same time, a striking plant from Japan, possibly, was beginning to show up in specialty nurseries and online. Initially, it was called agave bloodspot, but to Tony Avent, it was clear that it was another agave ex-Manfreda hybrid, most likely agave macroacantha crossed with Manfreda maculata. So it was renamed Mangave bloodspot. To this day, the creator of bloodspot has never been identified, but it's gone on to become one of the most popular mangaves, and it continues to be used as a parent for new hybrids because it has both a beautiful leaf form and it has the purple spotting that's so desirable. Tony Avent's Plant Delights Nursery was an early pioneer in creating new mangaves, but they realized pretty quickly that they didn't have the bandwidth and the necessary resources to propagate them on a commercial scale. So Tony Avent turned Plant Delights mangave work over to Hans Hansen, the guy who had first tissue cultured machamocha. Hans had since become director of new plant development at Walters Gardens in Zeeland, Michigan, one of the country's largest wholesale plant growers. Hans was able to keep his mangave collection in one of the greenhouses at Walters Gardens, although initially the company didn't have much interest in mangaves. Hans continued making more mangaves as a sideline, but as the popularity of succulents, especially softer leaf succulents, began to explode in the 2010s, Walters Gardens marketing team finally took notice and they began to embrace Hans's Mangave project because they saw commercial potential. 2 years later, in 2016, Walters Gardens released the first two of Hans's creations, Mangave Pineapple Express and Moonglow. And in 2017, 7 more were released. The fact that out of the ones you see up there, at least 3/4 of them are still in production is a testament to their popularity and their beauty. So they got it right from the beginning. These introductions were commercially successful, and Walters Gardens decided to invest more money into marketing them to a wider audience, not just specialty succulent collectors. They launched the Mad About Mangave campaign, complete with posters and plant tags and beautiful photos. So plant tags and materials that nurseries could use to advertise mangaves. This opened the floodgates, and since then, Walters Gardens has been introducing new mangaves almost every year. If I begin to sound a little bit like a salesman for Walters Gardens, I'm not, but they are still the leading commercial producer of mangaves. Nobody else is even close. Altman's, for example, only has 2, which I'll show you later. Oops, sorry. Today, you can buy mangaves just about anywhere. Brick and mortar stores usually carry a few, so maybe 3 or 4, but online you can find pretty much everything. In retail nurseries, they have eye-catching displays like these for praying hands. So, customers walk into the nursery, they see this, they immediately going to walk over and see what it is. They are marketed as a mainstream product because they're so versatile, both as container plants and in the ground. Hans Hansen once said, Mangaves do for the sun garden what hostas do for the shade garden. He should know because he's a world-renowned hosta hybridizer as well. And that kind of sums up the universal appeal that mangaves have, at least in Walter's Garden's opinion. In places that have a harsher climate like ours, which, is probably most of the country, they are apparently sold as annuals. My friend Lori sent me this picture taken at a nursery in Portland, where they were first sold. This mangave, whatever it is, was first sold as an annual, and then it was discounted to $5. It seems a bit crazy to me, but gardeners in the Midwest and on the East Coast, they grow a lot of plants as annuals that, out here we would consider perennials. Much of the credit for the popularity of mangaves goes to social media. Once influencers on TikTok or Facebook or Instagram or whatever begin to show a plant, then everybody needs to have one. This guy is Michael Perry, aka Mr. Plant Geek. He's a leading social media influencer from the UK, and he tirelessly posts pictures of himself surrounded by plants like here mangaves. And he loves them so much, he got a huge back tattoo with 5 mangaves. Kind of crazy, right? Here's the current lineup of Manfredas and mangaves sold by Walter's Gardens. The first two, cherry chocolate chip and mint chocolate chip, are straight Manfreda cultivars. The others are all hybrids. As you can see already, there's a huge variety now in terms of size, leaf color, growth habit. Some mangaves look more like Manfredas. They have soft, rubbery leaves that break fairly easily, so you have to be careful when you work around them. Others look a lot more like agaves. They have stiff leaves, teeth along the leaf margins, and terminal spines. The initial batch of mangaves was pretty much 50-50, but since then, the hybrids have become so complex that, the genes are all mixed up, and there are mangaves like praying hands that, if it weren't for the purple spotting, you'd swear are agaves rather than mangaves. Hans Hansen told me that at Walter's Gardens, they have an extensive pollen library. Pollen apparently freezes well and in commercial freezers, it lasts up to 10 years. So whenever they want to create a new hybrid, they can just simply, pull out the pollen they need and hybridize for the traits that they're after. In addition to general appearance, what Walter's Gardens is doing now is trying to create mangaves that are hardier than, the first batch, because most of the country is not in zone 9 and 10 like we are. So they need plants that are, tougher. People otherwise would have to buy them as annuals. And if they don't have room in their house in the winter, they simply toss them and start again the next year. By using cold, hardy agave species like Perrii, Ovatifolia, Montana, Walter's Gardens has been able to improve the cold hardiness down to zone 7. That opens up, a much larger clientele than they would have first had. Availability varies, and it depends on what Walter's Gardens is able to produce. That means you may not find everything at a retail nursery at any given time. This gives you an idea of what is currently in production. With the exception of Matcha Mocha and Bloodspot, most mangaves you find in nurseries are from Walter's Gardens, but others have started to make mangaves too. This includes Altman Plants, the country's largest plant producer, as well as backyard growers and hobbyists like, I'll show you some later. Altman Plants has introduced only 2 mangaves so far that I'm aware of. First one was Barney. The second one is Tequila Fire, and you find, whoops, sorry, Barney and Tequila Fire, and they're sold at Lowe's and Home Depots and the big box stores. So that's where you will find Altman plants. Altman is the producer of the little succulents that you usually see by the checkout, by sold by the thousands. I read that their focus is on increasing improving the longevity of the plant so it doesn't flower after just 2 or 3 years and then dies like many of the Walter's Gardens mangaves do. And I think it would be awesome if you had a beautiful plant that lasts, 7 years, 8 years, or whatever, longer than the ones that we have now do. Brian has created several striking mangaves. He brought one in, at least one or two, right? I'm going to show you a few of them. This is Purple Ribbons, a cross between Matcha Mocha and Agave Paprika Rioi. It was growing on. A few more photos, but then it flowered and it died. I don't know. Do you have any others? This one, did you plan some out or? Okay. Blue Fountain is a cross between Agave Parasana and Manfreda Dittda, which he showed earlier in his Manfreda presentation. I think it's a beautiful, beautiful urn-like shape. Here it is in flower. And I assume there's more of those too. Wow. Brian said it flowered for almost 8 months, but it did die and quickly, I assume, after that. Did it produce offsets? Yeah, it produced offsets. Here's another hybrid of Brian's, Agave Marmorata crossed with Manfreda Dittda. I'd love to see this one in the ground because Agave Marmorata is a very large agave. Do you have this growing in the ground? So you have any idea of how big it would get? It's about 5 feet across now already. I gotta look for that the next time at the Ruth Bancroft Garden. Now some backyard growers. Steve Super has a small nursery in Los Osos on the Central Coast. He's been creating a number of cool mango, and his focus is on making smaller ones that are maybe, a foot or smaller, so you can have a collection in containers instead of having to put them in the ground. He sells his plants through his website, stevesupergardens.com. Nick, many of you know Nick Deinhard. He is an incredible aloe hybridizer. He also lives on the Central Coast. He's been making mangaves. And the ones you see here, these 3, Mangave Bloodspot crossed with Agave Blue Glow, these are all seedlings from the same seed batch. So just like the plants that Justin brought in, there's tremendous variability in the same seedling batch. If you saw these pictures and didn't know what these plants were, you would realize that they're, the same cross. Here's some more. Bloodspot crossed with the Oteroi on the left and Bloodspot crossed with Ismensis on the right. I think any of these are just every bit as beautiful as what Walter's Gardens has released. But of course, Nick and Steve and Brian too, they do it on a very small scale and their plants aren't tissue cultured. This is a very small one. It's only 4 inches across, called Spotted Porcupine. I bought it last year at the Sacramento Cactus and Succulent Society show. I know nothing about it other than the tag said it's Bloodspot crossed with Agave Tumayana Bella. I don't know who created it, where it came from. And I've never seen it again. I'd love to have a few more because it's a miniature version of Bloodspot, a little bit greener. You could have, any number of them in the garden or you can have them in pots. These photos were taken by Brian at Nathan Wong's house in Hawaii. Nathan Wong was a longtime friend of Brian's and a leading force in the Honolulu Cactus and Succulent Society, but sadly he died a few years ago. But when Brian visited him in Hawaii, he took photos of some mangaves that Nathan had. They were done by breeders in Hawaii. Brian doesn't know who the actual breeders were. Some of them, or maybe all of them, might have been done by Nathan himself. But what this shows is that quite a few people are working on mangaves, and really anybody can do it. The barriers to entry are not very high. All you need is a flowering mangave, agave and a flowering manfreda, and you go to town. Now they're created, mangaves are created the same way as any hybrid, really. You transfer pollen from parent A to parent B. In nature, it's done by pollinators, but hybridizers use all kinds of tools like paintbrushes or makeup applicators. Sometimes they cut off the flower with the pollen and take it straight to the receiving flower and transfer the pollen that way. I hope this works. This is a short video that shows a volunteer at Juniper Level Botanic Garden in North Carolina, hand pollinating a mangave blue mammoth. And as you see, it's quite an undertaking because some of these flowers are very tall. No sound? Okay, so there's no sound, but it's subtitled. I actually intentionally subtitled it because I was afraid there might be no sound. So this is agave blue mammoth, which was created at Plant Delights Nursery, which is Juniper Level Botanical Garden is basically affiliated with Plant Delights Nursery. So this blue mammoth is in flower, and this volunteer has applied pollens from different varieties already. You see the tags. And he is going to apply pollen from agave bracteosa, which we will see in a second. It's a bit comical because it's so tall. He has to go up on this very rickety step ladder, which I don't think is OSHA approved. So he's taking the spent flowers off, and he is also going to remove the pollen from the flowers because he wants to make sure that there's no cross-contamination. As he says, some of them have been self-pollinated. Are they all self-fertile or no? So that's another thing nobody knows really. I wish we had sound, but just going to go a little bit further because I want you to see the amount of pollen that he has. I have no idea how many agave bracteosa flowers he needed to create the amount of pollen that he will apply or that he has at his disposal. It's kind of an anticlimactic when you don't have sound. So this is a good close-up of the flowers. So he's pulling all that off. He just wants to have the stamen left. The pistil. Stigma. He says the stigma is, when it's sticky like that, it's receptive. It also sticks out much further than it does when the flower first opens. Okay, now look at the amount of pollen. I mean, how many flowers, Brian, do you think that is? It's an insane amount of pollen. Oh, Brian says one agave bracteosa can make 10,000 flowers. So I guess maybe it was just one plant. So he applies it very carefully. And then he says that he repeats this after about a week to make sure everything is pollinated. Okay, gotta go on. It's not very interesting without sound. I oh, oh actually I could have played this here. I have sound. Now, after you've pollinated the seed parent and harvested the seeds and grown the seedlings for a few years and picked out the best ones, you have to propagate your creation. And the best way to do it, or the only way to do it on a commercial scale, is through tissue culture or micropropagation. I have a small video that shows the tissue culture lab at Walter's Gardens. And I had frankly never, I mean, I've never been inside a tissue culture lab, or I've never really seen how things work on the inside of a tissue culture lab. So this is very interesting. And I'm going to turn off, up the sound on this. So maybe you can hear it. It's better than nothing. As I said, Walter's Gardens is the one of the largest plant growers in the country. Succulents aren't really their thing. They just make mangaves and a few agaves, but a lot, sorry, a lot of the perennials you buy, like Proven Winners is one of their brands. So a lot of plants you buy in regular nurseries are from them. Oops, sorry. How do I go back? Oh no. Okay, I don't know what I did, John. It says it needs your ID or password. I don't know what I did. So we got to do it again without sound, but at least there are subtitles. Sorry for the technical issues. I think it just needs your finger, right? Could have left your finger here. So basically you start with the plant that you want to propagate, and then you whittle it down to the meristem, so just to the growing points. And then you sterilize that little bitty piece of plant to within an inch of its life. So there's no contamination from fungi. And then you put that little plantlet in a growing medium. And then after it's reached a certain size, you basically divide it. You pot up these little cuttings, and once they're big enough, you divide them again, and then you repeat it and repeat it and repeat it, and over time you get thousands of identical plants. This is what the plantlets, the tissue culture plantlets look like after a few months when they're ready to be sold to wholesale growers. So wholesale growers basically get these tiny plants, then they grow them on until they're a certain size, to be sold to retail nurseries. I volunteer at the UC Davis Arboretum Teaching Nursery, and we often get these plugs. There's like 72 or 98 to one tray. These are the little plugs that then get put in 3 or 4 inch pots, and then later they get potted up to 1 gallon. Now let's take a closer look at some of the mangaves from Walter's Gardens. I won't be able to show you every single one in existence because I read that now there are over 100 named mangave varieties. And I think, we're just at the beginning of this evolution, and there'll be many, many more to come as more people get involved. I have the parentage of the crosses there. I'm not going to talk about that because otherwise we'd be here forever. This is Arctic fox. It's a sport off of a plant called jaguar, which is this. Jaguar is all green, but it somehow throws a lot of variegated pups. This is Arctic fox. We'll see some others next later on, like kaleidoscope. They all come from a rather unassuming looking plant that some people even think it's not a mangave at all, but just a selection of Manfreda guttata. This is a real mangave. Aztec king. It's crossed with Manfreda crossed with agave vatifolia. That's why you get this size. It's much wider than it's tall. And it has leaves that droop down, which means it looks best when it's raised up a little bit so the leaves have room. This is one most of you might have seen, Bad Hair Day. It's been very popular from the beginning because people like to put it in face planters. There's also a variegated sport called wigging out that's on the market now. I'll show you that later. Here's Bad Hair Day growing in the sun. As you can see in full sun, the leaves turn much, much more purple than they would in a shadier situation. Black Magic came out a few years ago, and it has some of the darkest leaves yet on a mangave. But again, it requires full sun to get this deep, rich purple color in the shade. It wouldn't be quite as beautiful. This is a plant in my garden, but unfortunately it flowered after just 2 years and it did not leave any offsets. Maybe I should have waited longer, but whenever it's done blooming, I take them out. You could wait longer and see if offsets form. Come on. Blazing Saddles is one of the smallest ones. It has intense red, almost red coloration in the sun. Bridal Falls, a completely different look. I mean, you already get the idea that there's just a huge range of looks and growing habits. This also would look best raised up a little bit, maybe in a tall urn so the leaves can hang down. Catch a Wave is a smaller, wavier plant. Maybe not the most attractive, but it's good for a smaller container. Crazy Cowlick has the apple green leaves that its agave parent, Agave bovicornuta, has. I don't think it's in production anymore, but this was an early favorite of mine. I think it's a great plant, and here in the garden in Oakland, it's combined with ferns and lomandras, and it shows that mangaves are not just for hardcore succulent people. Mainstream gardeners can you put them in their garden as well to great effect. Desert Dragon is sort of a crazy looking thing with wavy leaves. The plant itself is only about 6 inches tall. It's completely unarmed. So this is a plant you can plant where you have children or pets or worry about people that might otherwise get stabbed. Falling Waters, another fairly big one with drooping leaves. Looks best in a tall container like here. Fiercely Fabulous is another big one for landscaping. I actually like both colors. On the right is in more shade. On the left is in full sun. I think both of them look good. Frosted Elegance, completely different from anything else. Come on, there. This is Inkblot, one of the first two mangaves introduced by Walter's Gardens. It's still in production. You still see it in nurseries. I like it, it's just a classic mangave look. This one here, Iron Man, is one of the most agave-like mangaves. The leaves are fairly stiff. The teeth along the leaf margins are, well, they're not exactly soft. There's a terminal spine, so this is not a plant you want to, plant along your walkway. It's also slower growing. In general, I'd say the higher the share of agave genes, the slower the plant is because agaves grow much slower, more slowly than manfredas do. This here is a very interesting oddity. It's not a mangave, it's a Hansera, which is a cross between three hybrids, Manfreda, agave, and Polyanthes, or the tuberose. Was done by Hans Hansen at Walter's Gardens. I think the goal was to get basically a mangave with the flowers of a tuberose, and the flowers are very tuberose-like. Unfortunately, they're not scented. And that is the real attraction of a tuberose. So I assume there's probably more development work going on. Would be wonderful to have um, a hybrid like this with very fragrant flowers. This is Kaleidoscope. It's a sport of jaguar that I showed you earlier. In full sun, it takes on, all kinds of shades of yellow and pink and purple and green. It's a beautiful plant. Unfortunately, it does tend to pop a lot. So after a while, this is my plant. I actually just took this out, dug it up, separated the pops and put the largest plant back in the ground because I like the solitary look much better than an unruly clump. Sometimes the question was when you separate the pops, do the pops have roots? Some of them do, some don't, but even if they don't, you stick them in some potting mix and they form roots when it's warm outside. Right now is not a good time. If you did it right now, they would just sit there all winter. But from spring through fall, they root fairly quickly. This is Lavender Lady, which is probably the most popular mangave to date, and it's easy to see why. It has just a beautiful shape with a touch of purple in the leaves. Here's some more in a container. I think this was Justin's plant. And in the ground in my garden. I love this plant. I could, I would never want to be without it. Man of Steel is an agave striata cross. If you've ever seen agave striata, it's a very, very prickly agave with very stiff leaves. This inherited some of those traits from its agave parent. The leaves are stiff. The terminal spine is pretty, it's ouchy. But the rosetted forms is beautiful, and it has a just a really nice coloration that you don't see that often in mangaves. Mayan Queen looks also a lot more like an agave, but the purple coloration is always a giveaway that when you look at it, you think, is it agave? If it's purple, it's not an agave. It's a mangave because it gets the purple coloration from the Manfreda. Mission to Mars is one of the largest introductions to date. And I think it's also one of the most beautiful landscaping plants if you give it enough room. This is at the Ruth Bancroft Garden. I believe they've all died since, they've all bloomed since then, right? This was my plant. Beautiful form, beautiful symmetry, great colors in full sun. The question is when a mangave starts to flower, whether it's better to remove the stem early on to encourage it to make pups and the stem is ugly. I don't really know if cutting the stem off does anything. Brian, do you think it speeds up the production of offsets? I don't think so. I think it's a process. Once it's started, it just has to run its course. But it's your plant. You can do whatever you want. You're the master of your garden. This is Night Owl, a smaller plant with really wavy leaves that go all over the place. Some people don't like this look. I actually like it. It also has some of the darkest colors that we've seen in mangaves to date. This is Permanent Wave. It's one of the newest introductions from Walter's Gardens, and it's an agave vatifolia cross. It gets, the goal I think was plant that looks a little bit like an agave vatifolia, but is faster growing. This, in comparison, is agave vatifolia, which gets, some plants I've heard get to like 6 feet across. Walter's Garden says this will get to about 3 feet across, so, much more manageable. This is in my garden. I love this plant. The coloration, the leaf coloration is just crazy. Pineapple Express is one of the first introductions. and it's still in production. People must buy it. This is one called Pineapple Punch. It's a variegated form of Pineapple Express, which to me is one of the most insanely attractive mangaves, especially when you look at it from the top. The coloration and the symmetry is just perfect. And since then, there's been another variegated form called Pineapple Upside Down Cake. So you get it, Pineapple Express, Pineapple Punch, Pineapple Upside Down Cake. They must have a lot of fun naming plants at Walter's Gardens. I've not actually seen this one, but I believe it is in production, so we should be seeing it in nurseries next year. And now we get to praying hands. I have more photos of praying hands than any other because it happens to be my favorite. It's a hybrid with agave okahui, which also kind of forms a ball-like shape. This looks like unlike anything else that has been done. So it's a real triumph to get a mangave that looks so different from anything else. Unfortunately, since it's more agave-like than many others, it's also fairly slow growing. I've had one for about 4 years, and mine is now close to the top one in size. It's in the ground. They do really well in the ground. But, you know, they're small enough to put in a container. This photo I just saw on YouTube, and this is the largest one, the largest specimen yet. I had no idea they even get that big because agave okahui, this is agave okahui, doesn't typically get that big, does it, Brian? No, it stays much, much smaller. Purple People Eater has, I love that name. When I saw the name, I knew I had to have the plant. And it's a pretty attractive plant too, very agave-like with fairly stiff leaves, but beautiful, beautifully colored teeth and really nice purple pigmentation in full sun. This, on the other hand, is a completely blue cross, racing stripes. It's a cross with agave lophantha, which you can tell by the central stripe. This plant never turns purple, doesn't even have a hint of purple, even in full sun, it stays completely green. Agave red wing in full sun turns a really rich red, purplish red. Silver fox, which was the parent for Justin's cross. I think there's a silver fox on the table as well. Yes, they do. And they work closely with Plant Delights Nursery and also with San Marcos growers. So you go to San Marcos growers, which I think is the best plant website out there anyway. And Plant Delights Nursery has a good website and they have a lot of information about cold hardiness, which, you know, to Plant Delights Nurseries in North Carolina. So for them, that matters a lot more than it does to us out here. So the silver fox on the left is in more or less full shade. So it's sort of a bluish, steely blue. The one on the right is in more sun and it gets a purple overlay. Snow leopard is another cross, another sport that came off of jaguar, which is amazing because jaguar, as I said, is not a super attractive plant, but it's produced a number of really beautiful variegated plants. This is called sponge paint. It's an agave potatorum cross. It's also one of the smallest. This is a plant in my garden and it topped out at just a foot. It has beautiful symmetry, fairly stiff leaves, but the spines are not that lethal. Spotty Dotty is another one, great name. It's one of those plants that is wider than tall with curly leaves that go all over the place. Beautiful pigmentation. Tooth Fairy, I mean, I swear if you saw this, you'd think it's an agave, but of course it has purple leaves, so it can't be. It is probably the most agave-like mangave, and it's a cross with agave shoyi. And if you've seen agave shoyi, the teeth that you see in the middle, the young teeth, they're very typical of agave shoyi. So it inherited all the good traits from its agave parent. Whale tail is aptly named since it's an agave avatifolia cross. Agave avatifolia is the whale tongue agave. It's really wide and not very tall. This is in a parking lot of a nursery in Sacramento, and it's great for an application like that where it can fill a big space without bumping into any other plants. And this is the last one. It's called wigging out. It's a variegated sport of bad hair day. Now, I've just shown you some sports. I've used the word sport for variegated plants like kaleidoscope pineapple punch. In botany, a sport is a new variant of an existing plant that is thought to be the result of genetic mutation. It happens randomly in nature, but it happens particularly frequently, it seems, with these Mangave hybrids. I don't know that anybody knows why, but the most interesting sports have features that the parent doesn't have, like variegation, and that's what makes them so attractive. Some of the ones I'm going to show you were found in Walter's Gardens, and they were already named and plant patents were applied for. So it stands to reason that they will be in production at some point and available for sale. And for these sports, I show you the parent plant in the upper left corner. This is the sport of a blood spot. I mean, it really doesn't look much like blood spot, but the purple pigments that in blood spot are pretty evenly distributed across the leaf surface. They have migrated to the leaf margins, leaving this sort of chartreuse colored central stripe. This is Foxy Lady, a sport of silver fox that turns much more purple than silver fox does, with a very attractive pinkish creamy leaf margin. Frosted jade, you look at frosted jade is sort of a standout anyway because it's mostly green, bluish green. But this sport looks nothing like the plant that it came off of. It has green margins and a really beautiful creamy stripe in the middle. I would love to have this plant, but it's not available for sale yet. Inky fingers, it's a sport of ink plot. Forms super. I have this plant and it actually does look like this in full sun. Just super interesting look. This is called Life on Mars. It's sort of a variegated form of Mission to Mars. This is Queen for a Day. It came from Mayan Queen. Again, the purple pigments have migrated towards the leaf margins, leaving this cream to mint colored stripe in the middle. Sweet Tooth, originally Tooth Fairy. And it's just amazing how Tooth Fairy is a purple plant, and then you get this. This is called Wingman. It's a sport of red wing. And I think this might be the most colorful Mangave yet. Some pictures I found in the Planted Mangave group on Facebook. This is a sport of Barney. Blazing Saddle. Again, the same phenomenon where the pigments, for some reason, migrate to the leaf margins. I don't know that anybody knows why that happens. This is the most insane one, I think. It's a sport of Lavender Lady. This is, if you've heard of Tony Kroc, he's a grower in Santa Barbara. This is a plant that he found in a batch of Lavender Lady plants at a wholesale nursery, and he grabbed it. It's produced some offsets, but he said only about 20% of the offsets are variegated. The others just revert back to the classic Lavender Lady. This is a sport of Mission to Mars that a friend of mine, Michelle, hi Michelle, I know you're out there. She found this on Saturday at the UC Davis Arboretum plant sale in a batch of Mission to Mars, which I had looked at many times before, and I didn't notice it. She noticed it right away, and she grabbed it. And that's also how I got my variegated praying hands that's down there. I volunteer at the nursery where we propagate and pot up plants for their plant sales. So this was in a batch of 50 praying hands plugs that they got from Walter's Gardens, and it was the only one that was variegated. Come on, not just almost done. A few notes on the cultivation, and Brian touched on this already. Most, I think all Manfredas, or most Manfredas are deciduous. This includes named cultivars like chocolate chip. So mangaves that have mostly Manfreda genes will also be deciduous. This is a plant of mine, a Manfreda that I had in my garden, and it looked like this in the winter, and I thought, well, it had just rotted, so I dug it up and threw it out. Little did I know that it was just going dormant. You know, the leaves just go dormant, disappear altogether, and in the spring they come back looking, you know, more beautiful than ever. So if you have one of those and the leaves begin to die, don't give up on it. Although I think in the Bay Area, you probably are not going to see this because it just simply isn't cold enough for plants to go dormant. Brian also touched on this. Do they die after flowering? If you are on any of the plant groups on Facebook, I mean, in those plant groups, any topic always ends up in heated controversy and people go at each other. It's like people swear that they have a mangave that flowered and it did not die, and then others said that's not possible. Brian already explained it. The rosette that flowers will die after flowering, but if you have a clumping variety, there are so many other plants around it that they take over the space of the original rosette, and it seems like nothing died, but the plant that flowered, that one plant did die. And it typically forms either bulbils on the leaf stems or offsets. Too much of a good thing, I already touched on that. The one on the right is my Pineapple Express, which is seriously out of control. I mean, maybe people like this look, I don't. It's just that my eyes don't know where to go. So, you know, take it out of the ground, separate all the pups, give them away. I mean, you'll have so many, you probably end up throwing some away because none of your friends will want them because they already gave them some before. And then just start again with, you know, the best, the largest plant. Availability varies in your local nursery, like the Ruth Bancroft Garden. I'm sure there's always a few that you have, right? Any nursery in the Bay Area will have a few plants, just maybe not necessarily the ones that you're after. Plant Delights Nursery is a great nursery. They sell their plants. They say they're 3.5-inch plants, but they're actually, you get them, yeah, they're in 3.5-inch pots. The plants are very good size. The downside is the plants are expensive and shipping to California is insanely expensive. But they have mangaves that nobody else has. So if you're a hardcore collector, you know, it's your go-to. Mountain Crest Garden is another online nursery. They sell plugs or plants that are slightly larger than a plug. So maybe 2 inches across. So when you get one, you think, oh my God, this is a puny plant. But you know, you pot them up and they actually will grow pretty quickly. Then eBay, Etsy, you know, the usual online sources, you'll find anything you might want. And in the spring and fall, come to Davis. The UC Davis Arboretum plant sales have a lot of mangaves. In the clearance sale that we had last weekend, there were 13 different Walter's Gardens mangaves, which is actually a large number for a nursery, and they're reasonably priced too. Here are some sources for more information. And you have any questions later on, you know, you can email me or Brian. Does anybody have any questions now? I probably killed you with mangave overload. You'll either go home and want to get some for your garden, or you say, I never want to see another mangave again. Any questions? John has a question?
Gerhard, maybe we can do the questions one-to-one. You can talk to the people directly after.
Okay, yeah, we can do that. It doesn't
It's
seem
getting
like,
pretty late.
yeah, it doesn't seem like there's, you know, great number of questions anyway. So thank you very much.